Got it. Okay. Okay, now we're streaming. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to Weekly Wednesday. I am Sneha Jadhav. Okay. Sorry for the delay. I had to couple of logistical things. So anyways, thank you so much for joining in today. Today we have Christian with us, and also sorry for the delayed start. We were having some logistical issues on our end. But anyways, without further ado, I do want to welcome Christian today. Christian, it's a little bit of a change from our regular topics that we've been going down, but nonetheless very related to our everyday lives, the work that we do every day. And Christian's going to talk about managing complexity. Christian has this new a new podcast that he's launching, and he's going to talk about the podcast. But before we get started and get deep into conversations, I do want to give Christian a chance to introduce himself. Christian, do you want to take it away?
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot. And I think, okay, so how can I start? I think the story of the podcast, it's kind of very much linked with my personal story. So I would like, let's say, to take the chance here to start from there. So I have a background. I'm a physicist. I started sort of quantum statistical physics back in the days. But then I felt that while it was very interesting, that field was very much related to a lot of things, including machine learning. I spent a lot of time working afterwards, and especially chaos theory and complexity theory. But I always struggled at the time to feel what was the sort of the application. And I was always very much interested also more, not only in the theoretical work, but also on the business side of things. So then I moved into my career, work a lot into technology innovation, especially around and especially, of course, application of IoT. That's also where, so in the field where I started, for example, collaborating with Suda many years ago, but also machine learning and AI, as I mentioned, an application of the two in many sectors, energy, smart cities, and so forth. And then I spent all my career also managing larger and larger organizations. And then I started realizing that some of the things that were coming out of complexity theory work could be actually applied, for example, in managing technologies and in organizations as well. And you can see all the patterns coming out, for example, like Moore's laws, like the law of accelerating returns applied to different technologies, or Wright's law as well. But also when you look into things like agile, that leads into self-organization and complex adaptive systems. So in that sense, I could see a body of work that was sort of somehow converging into that. And at that time, I started a bit to get interested again and see the application of things that I studied many years ago into kind of my day-to-day life. And then I started building my own word, let's say, my own word of sort of knowledge. And then first I started disseminating it at the Barcelona Technology School, where I'm involved, and I created a masterclass in complexity management. But then it became more something that I said, well, actually, I really like there were a podcast talking about these things. And I couldn't really find one. And that's kind of the mindset. Okay, but then probably it's better to start one. That's why I'm here, and that's why sort of.
I did listen to your the first episode of your podcast, and I have to tell you, it was very succinct. The name of the podcast for everyone else, it's called Engines of Creation. Thanks. I'll paste the link shortly for the podcast and for Christian's website, which has different links for wherever you get your podcast from. But I think it was a very succinct episode, and I walked back with a very clear message, right? A very clear message is like the first episode was, do not delay change. That's what I walk back with. And I think there is, like, you're right, there aren't a lot of podcasts that give you such succinct, such focused message. And something that relates to someone who's worked in tech, or we're working in tech, right? It's very, 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 very interesting. So I would encourage everyone to please go and take a listen. These are short episodes, so it's not like so it will not take a lot of time, but it will really help you. So I think let's get into this, right? Like, so we were going to talk about complexity. So we're going to talk about, help us understand, help us define a little bit of complexity, and then we can touch on to other points and as we go along with examples.
No, yeah, definitely. And I hope the more we go into that, the more we'll understand that this relates to everybody's sort of work, and especially if you work in digital and technology in general, you face a lot of complexity constantly. And I think there is an element about changing your mindset and the way you approach things. So at the end, a couple of things to take into account. I mean, let's start from change, because I think that's not by chance of the first episode, and it was focused on change, because I think that's really the core standing point that helps everybody to embrace complexity, understanding the fact that the world is changing around us constantly, and you can even make the joke that change is the only constant. Actually, that's the only thing you know is gonna come, and that's very important, because especially when you apply that into technology innovation and in organizational change, you actually tend to see a lot that organizations tend to stay very static over time, and overall people in general, even if you work maybe into innovation bubble, sometimes you don't really see that, but actually people don't necessarily like change a lot. And therefore, there is a constant element of being able to explain that. But if you want to embrace complexity, you need to explain to everybody, listen, the world is complex, it's constantly change. So even if you are afraid to embrace that, that's really your only way to succeed. And there is an element of leadership, which is really about helping people to embrace change and not being afraid of that, which unfortunately for many years was actually the other way around. So there are a lot of, for example, methods around, I'm thinking about sort of very strict application of waterfall, where like, I have a 5 years plan and it must go according to plan. And if it doesn't go according to plan, it's really, really bad, which is what. And if you look at that, you actually find out that like 90% of the project, at least, they have to change the plan, and it's nobody's fault. It's just because life happened in the meantime. And it's kind of living in denial if you think you can have a 2, 3 years, 4 years plan and nothing is going to change. And then you enter into that outcome and you need to make a change request and things like that. But actually, you can look at things and say, well, let's start from saying change is the only thing. And then let's build frameworks that start from change as the sort of only assumption. And then you can look into sort of a lot of lean applications, continuous improvement, agile. So there is a stream of work that goes in that direction. So, and that's, I think, is the first element. Then there are other elements I think the other element which is very important about complexity is understanding that complexity is really about having multiple agents interacting at the same time, and that it doesn't really matter what's the topic about, and we can maybe delve down in a few examples about that, but later on. But when you have multiple agents interacting at the same time, the value of complexity is that you cannot necessarily understand very clearly the dynamics of these agents, but what you can see is that the emergence of new features that didn't exist explicitly before, and the point of emergence is it's where actual innovation arises. So my point, which is somehow the kind of the main message I'm trying to deliver in the podcast, is really like creating the conditions. How can you create the condition to have a constant stream of new things emerging out of your system, whatever is your system? It usually is a sort of a socio-technical system. You have a combination of sort of an organization made of human being interacting, but then also technologies and system interacting. And now, to be fair, with now AI becoming more and more intelligent, we might expect also artificial intelligence agents interacting into the loop, and we can already see cases of that. And again, how can you leverage that, and how can you set the condition to let creation emerge is really one of the core factors. And again, you need to relinquish the desire to control that. The only thing you can do is to create the condition, and then things will happen. You can maybe shape a bit of directions, but at the end, you always end up with situations that you couldn't expect before. And to me, that's really the beauty of looking at things from a complexity lens.
Right. I think you mentioned control, and then you mentioned how in 5 years, like for example, in a waterfall, things are going to change. How about we talk a little bit about assumptions? Because when we assume a system, or we say, okay, we're going to build this, there are certain assumptions that we place in and we feel that those assumptions hold true. And how does assumptions play with complexity? These are the assumptions, and we keep, I think one of the things in my world we say is that, hey, keep validating your assumptions. Are your assumptions true? How does that play into change and complexity?
Well, I think that's really at the core. So to be fair, agile methods and methodology sits at the core of the complexity. In particular, what is called the theory of complex adaptive systems. So many of the people that first contributed to the agile revolution were people coming out of the complex adaptive system sort of world. So in that sense, the only thing really that you can do is constantly check you start from somewhere, from whatever position, and the only thing you can really do is constantly inspect and see, where am I? Am I doing things right? Am I in the right direction? Yes, no. You need to validate your assumption constantly at any given time, and that's kind of the principal rule. Okay, if you think about that, I've heard there was an agile coach, a friend of mine many years ago. I remember one time told me, if you need to keep one thing about agile and lean is retrospective. But that's really about that. That's the most important thing, is stop and inspect. Where am I? What do I need to change assumptions? Yes, no, how? That's the most important thing. And that's basically the best way to navigate complexity.
Right. And then, and I think then another aspect that comes into play would be the ambiguity, right? We talked a little bit about that. I think the ambiguity plays into all aspects, even in defining the assumptions is an ambiguous activity, right? Making sure that, have we covered everything? Have we covered base with everything? Is the assumption even written in a way that can be validated? So can you help us a little bit on the ambiguity aspect of it?
Oh, yeah, I think, well, I see ambiguity, to me, is very strictly related to change, okay? In the sense that it is, you are facing a constantly evolving landscape in front of you, and in that sense, it's very difficult to find hooks and frameworks. So from that perspective, one of the core elements to manage complexity is really being able to frame and assess ambiguity. One of the frameworks which evolved a lot over time, so I suggest people maybe to look at directly the work of Dave Snowden, but Dave Snowden is the person who created, quite a few years ago, a very interesting framework which is called the Cinefin framework, which I think in Welsh means knowledge, if I remember correctly. But it is a very nice framework exactly to navigate ambiguity and complexity and trying to frame and understand, where am I? And that's very important, because when you are faced with a specific situation and you want to even assess your hypothesis, the reality is that you can usually break it down, and some areas are more straightforward, and you can probably apply some already known patterns. And some areas are way less known, and those are really where complexity arises. To be fair, in the Cinefin framework, there is also an element which is called chaos, okay, which is a place where it's almost impossible to discern even a pattern. And in a sense, it's also important to have that level of assessment, because you might also even say, listen, that's a space where at this moment, very unlikely you're going to be able to gain any insight, so it's better to step out of that. So there is an element where if you go beyond complexity, you enter into complete chaos, and then you cannot create anything and derive anything. But if you move into the complexity space, then you can derive an approach which is really about what's called the PDCA cycle, again related to lean, which is really plan, do, check, act. Okay, so you are in a place where, again, the only way where you can explore a complex system of sort is planning, making assumption, doing something, checking and reacting to that, and constantly iterating, which is kind of a leitmotiv, really. But that's one of the best way to assess ambiguity. But again, there are ways at least to be able to understand how to break your problems up, because it's also wrong sometimes to say everything is complex and then we're going to manage everything in the same way. I'm making a typical example I'm thinking about the software industry, okay? And if I'm setting up, I don't know, in some company, a new ERP system, but more or less I know what needs to be done, and it's a complicated system in most of the cases, not complex. And the difference of a complicated system is that I can actually derive a clear plan of action, which is more or less the same all the time. Of course, with a large organization, there are elements of complexity you have to break down. But that's kind of the work following this example about identifying, okay, what are the elements of my plan that are sort of, we know, I'm not going to say are simple, but I know what I have to do. And what are the areas, what are the unknowns that I need to explore before being able to make any plan out of that. And I think that's very relevant. So I mentioned the Cinnamon framework from Snowden, which also lately evolved into many other things. The latest evolution is called is touring, if my pronunciation is correct, model, which is something that is creating right now. There is also a very nice book from Luca Minudel. I can't recall. It's something about embracing complexity. Now I don't remember the title. Apologies. But Luca Minudel, he's a very well-known agile coach working in Ferrari Formula One, in ThoughtWorks, and so forth. And actually, in that book, you can find a long list of many different frameworks to manage complexity in any kind of project. And I think those are very, very useful tools.
You mentioned a framework. I think I don't think we caught it. Do you mind spelling it out? The framework.
The Cinefin. I can write it down afterwards. Is CINEFIN. Sorry, CYNEFYN. Again, is a Welsh word, as far as I know, since the author is Welsh, and the author is Snowden, David Snowden, if I remember correctly, and Dave, and he is very well known into, I would say, general these complexity management, but not only really around managing of complex projects, large projects, and things like that. And he created a lot of frameworks on this field.
Interesting. This is the first time I'm hearing about this framework, and thank you so much for sharing. I just had a quick look at the wiki, and it says it's a decision-making framework.
Exactly.
And paste the name of the framework here for the group. There you go. Someone, Adam did. So Adam did paste. But for everyone on YouTube, it is CYNEFIN framework. Thank you for sharing that. Do you want to get into now the examples, or from a system perspective? We can do from an organizational perspective, whatever you prefer, and we can go into and then we can have any follow-up questions we have from the audience, or even from even anything that you would like to share. But I think an example would really help us understand.
No, of course. Yeah, you mentioned system and organizations. I think we can that. I mean, on the system side, just because it's in everybody's mind, the best way is really looking at in the AI world around the large language models, and I mean, of course, thinking into GPT in particular, but not necessarily. But GPT, of course, is the best example. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT, GPT-4. GPT 3.5, blah, blah, blah. And now that's a very nice example, because it's a very nice example of emergence, of emergent properties. So if you look at the core of the technology, which is GPT means general purpose transformers, general pre-trained transformer, and that kind of gives away that the core technology is transformer technology. Without entering into the details that I'm sure actually, other people are way better than me to explain that. If you kind of look into that, you realize that, at the end, what they built with GPTs and other LLMs is a very good system that can, given a bag of word, a kind of a sentence, they can predict what's going to be the next word coming up. That's really what they do. Now, what they wouldn't necessarily expect is that with this very, very specific optimization function and an optimization goal, what they could get was a system that could pass high school tests and can pass easily the Turing test that eventually shows one thing that I always thought that Turing test is not necessarily a good test to identify artificial intelligence, but we understand where it comes from. And but I think that's a very relevant point. Okay, so it's really, that's a perfect example of emergence. So they created a condition in a system which is complex enough. Why? Because it has a lot of computation, allows that it has a lot of neurons, of nodes into this system and agents interacting, that the new properties emerge that weren't actually programmed in the system itself. The system wasn't programmed to pass an SAT test or something like that, but it does. And even, as they said, even the programmers said they were very surprised when they found out in the first trial. It was like, oh my God. But that's really that, and that's a perfect example of emergent property that comes out. And you can find a lot of example of that, of course, in physics, but also in sociology and in a lot of other technological situations. I mean, you can see, for example, other things like Moore laws and even more, which is kind of the derivation of Wright's law, which is more about manufacturing processes and so forth. And all these laws are kind of, again, emergent properties that comes out into sort of a repeated application of technology and agents interacting among themselves with a specific goal, in that case, of increasing the speed increasing the throughput of manufacturing for Wright rules and the speed of computation in case of Moore's law.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to just jump in a little bit, and one of the interesting things that ChatGPT did was it's an app. I think it is, as of today, it's the most ambiguous system that we know of, because we just know so little of it, right? Of its implications, how it's done. I think one of the things that they did to deal with ambiguity was they limited the timeline. Is that an accurate perspective from, do you think that's an accurate? Because one of the things that they did that, hey, all the results are as of this date. They are not latest, they are not up to date, they are as of this date. So they, in some way, they restricted the inputs to the system and said, hey, and set the expectation saying that do not expect accurate results for anything post this date. Up to this date is what we have trained our system in. And I think it was an interesting way to put the system out there. What do you think about that perspective?
Okay, well, that opens up probably a completely different debate, but it's a very good question. So I think the issue there is that what OpenAI wanted to do was to, there is an element of marketing in there, in the sense that what they wanted to showcase the power of these new systems. And that was really kind of the main point. And I believe, that's my personal view, exactly because they wanted to raise awareness to this specific problem, because that's why OpenAI was set up in the first place. So I think the fact that they wanted, but we don't have to forget this is a test system. So if you focus on a language model which is somehow static, in the sense that the pre-trained model per se it's built on a knowledge base and doesn't change and that in the way it is done, it makes the testing way more, I would say, simpler, and let the team focus on the real let me call user experience or user interfaces issues, which were the areas that are the areas that needs more exploration. Within this, when I say user experience, user interface, I do believe that a big chunk of that is ethical issues as well. But it's not the only thing, of course. But how do you interact with the system in a way that is meaningful and so forth. In that sense, we are all acting every time we interact with ChatGPT as a beta testers, and in that sense, we are helping them to improve the system itself, and especially the user interface with the system. The fact that the model has hallucinations. I mean, it is, Well, maybe if I take I don't know, maybe, I mean, I didn't work on machine learning before it was a cool thing. I would argue it is a kind of a normal behavior of any especially neural network. And the main reason is, as you mentioned, is because they tend to be black boxes, and they tend to have quirks and how can you call them? I mean, they are covering a functional space, and there are parts of these spaces that are not covering very well. That's actually what's happening there, and therefore, yes, it is a normal behavior. It's going to get better, yes. To me, what I find very, very interesting of going back to the emergent behavior is the fact that the system, with only training based on language, can show basic understanding of logic. And even though it doesn't use any symbolic logic reasoning inside, which is another branch of AI, completely other branch of AI, to me, that's like mind-blowing in a sense. That's really one of the things that, wow, besides the obvious capabilities, it's showing emergent behaviors which are really sort of surprising, and I think that's really also what they want to explore more.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. So moving to a little bit of a different sense. So if we move to look at complexity and change from an organizational perspective, do you want to share some examples on that?
Yes, there are quite a lot. I think okay, so I already mentioned I will take, let me take a few angles on that, because the organizational side I find personally very, very interesting, exactly because it's more complex by nature, because their organizations are made of human agents, which are unpredictable by sort of definition, and in that, or well, you might argue they are predictable, but let's say, but not in an easy fashion. Okay, jokes and puns aside, of course, and what I meant to say is that there are different angles there. So one angle is the one I touched already about around agile, lean methodologies. So those are sort of there is a constant application of these methodologies already shaped and evolved a lot of organizations. You can see like the modern digital companies, companies like, of course, we can think about Amazon, but think of companies more like about Netflix, for example. They tend to naturally become more distributed and self-organizing in some fashion. And that's really, again, the push of the evolution of lean methodologies and agile methodologies over the years. So there is a trend there, which is clear, and to me, that's really one of the first elements of managing complexity. Now, the thing is, though, that what I've seen over the years a lot of the time is that there is a tendency still to mix a bit up this sort of breaking this self-organizing structure around that could be called agile structure into some sort of hierarchical structure of sort, because that's what comes from, I would say, 100 years of management strategy and organizational sort of management in general. And so there is a bit of resistance to actually say, well, listen, let's break everything up. We don't need this hierarchy. So there is a tendency to have flatter and flatter organizations. But then now you also start seeing very interesting experiments of complete hierarchy-less or completely flat organizations coming out. And there are some nice examples. I would probably mention two, but there are out there a lot. If you're curious, actually was testing this morning, I had a good list on ChatGPT. Also, I got a good list on Bard, which is Google's equivalent, but I would probably at the moment rank the list from ChatGPT more, at least personally more interested. ChatGPT understood better what I wanted to know. So you can actually ask, and they're going to come up with a lot of nice examples. But to be fair, one of the examples that ChatGPT came up with is, sorry, one of the examples I wanted to make ChatGPT didn't mention it, but I asked ChatGPT afterwards and told me, yes, you're right. Also, that one is correct. And it's called company called Satalia, which is an AI company. It's a UK AI company. It's not a big one, but they developed and created a very interesting model based on what they call swarm intelligence. So they create cells, but these cells also can, so in that sense, these cells can be also built and swarmed around specific needs. So they have, again, a hierarchical structure based on different, in a way, fractal based, because you want to group them at different sort of level to, if you have larger endeavors, for example, for larger customer and so forth. But there is an element where the core of the organization is completely flat, and they can swarm together to solve a complex problem depending by the need of the problem. And that's Satalia's model is very interesting. Another model which is interesting is in US is a company called Zappos, which is if I remember, is sort of a shopping and e-commerce shopping brand. And they, in 2015, they even introduced a very, very radical approach, which is called holacracy, if I remember correctly, which was very, very radical in that sense, because they got rid of completely of managers, so they didn't have any manager anymore. So there was sort of the board, and then everybody, these different separated teams. They kind of stepped back over the years from these very, very radical models, but it was kind of interesting in the way it evolved, because before, the idea was that they had a flat organization with different teams responsible for different parts of the business. And then they started evolving more into a place where they put managers, they brought back managers, but they gave way more business independence to the single unit. So in that sense, the single units also became more profit and loss based, owning of a part of the profit and loss instead of maybe owning a part of the business as a business function or something like that. So just to say, so there are a lot of experiments that are bringing some level of success, especially startups that are scaling up versus, of course, large organization that takes more time to change. One last thing I wanted to mention, going back to the Agile, kind of to close the loop and talk about, for example, Agile organization. Okay, there is a way more to talk about Agile frameworks and why they're not necessarily good, but there is a very nice application of scaled Agile, which is called Scrum at Scale, which tries to embrace this fractal, again, approach, this self-similarity approach, which is another typical element of complex systems, really trying to replicate what is called the Scrum level. But I mean, I suggest people to go and look to the model itself, because they on the product management and the sort of the continuous improvement side, it replicates as a fractal going up in the hierarchy, and that's also a very interesting way to approach it.
Can you please repeat the name of that again? Scrum
at Scale. You know, Scrum as a development, as a methodology. Scrum at Scale is this sort of way of scaling it. And that's, again, I find it very interesting, and it gets very close, I believe, to, the scaling of Scrum following complex adaptive systems mandates, but at larger scale. The original application of complex adaptive system were more, and in Scrum and in other Agile methodologies, was more about you want to enable self-organization and at team level, and that was the main focus. But then there was an element of recognizing over the years there was a need for a hierarchy, which comes from the scale of the organization. But again, a fractal hierarchy, it becomes more adaptable to
fractal hierarchy, you said?
Yeah, it goes back to the point of ambiguity. It becomes more flexible to face ambiguity, to face change, versus a structure. And I said before, a kind of a mix between Agile and a hierarchical structure per se, it tends to be brittle within a certain limit. That's also why, because, for example, I mean, there are a lot of conversation around, I know people know SAFe, scale Agile frameworks, which tend to go more into that sort of hierarchical and Agile at the same time, and in that sense, it seems it's not bringing the same level of success.
Right. Yeah, it is. So, I mean, let me ask you one very, very contentious question that we have these days is, and I think it's been there ever since we've been talking about Agile, is how long should a Scrum be? And should it be same across all teams? Or should it be, can it be separate? Like, can I say one of my teams has a 2-week scrum versus another has a 4-week scrum? Because time becomes a very, very important aspect in all projects, right? You need to be delivering on time. Leaders want to recognize value sooner. We want to deliver to customers sooner. So let's help us understand that a little bit.
Okay, so the one I said earlier that in general I'm not very keen towards agile frameworks, and the main reason is that each organization has their own needs and each team has their own needs. So it's I believe it's wrong to be prescriptive and say it's 2 weeks or it's 3 weeks or whatever. So in the sense that there is an element of there is always a compromise to make. And it depends a lot by the nature of the business. So if you ask me, as a rule of thumb, which is a rule of thumb that everybody knows, if you are strictly building software, often 2 weeks works. But I have right now in my current position, there are teams working with 3 weeks and works pretty well by the nature of the things they do. If you are more into Scrum application into hardware, or you might want hardware needs a little bit more time, so you might end up into 4-6 week sprints. Because for obvious reason, okay, so if you want to really have your system working and stuff, it takes a little bit more time. So that's where you are. But then when you go again at scaling, then the synchronization probably is a problem, in the sense that if you have squads that have stronger dependencies, then you might want to look into synchronize them versus in a situation where they can live pretty well decoupled, then you don't really care. Because as long as the feature is there, is deployed, and the others can use it, the customer or the other squad. So I think that's really, so again, the short answer is it depends. I hope I try to give also a longer answer that try to cover it all. But it's very important that it is something where the squads feel it is the best cadence for them in the end. Right.
No, I think this every role I go in, we have this question, we have this discussion at some point. Really, is 2 weeks working? Does everyone have to be on 2 weeks? Specifically when in IoT, when you're dealing with hardware too, there comes different levels of dependencies, firmware, they have different nature of this working, right? So I think that becomes a very, and I think just tying back the time part to the complexity, I think decentralizing decision-making kind of helps to remove the ambiguity sooner or in a much better way than if you have one person saying, this is the assumption, go by this, and follow this. If the responsibility of validating assumptions lies on one person right at the top, that becomes challenging. And I think that's frustrating too from a organizational perspective.
No,
right?
I completely agree. In that sense, I forgot to say a thing personally that I believe strongly when you talk about cadence. You don't need sprints. Okay, just also to stress. So that's also one decision. Okay, so if you follow lean software development, I mean, there are applications like Kanban and Kanban-like where you don't have sprints. So you actually release as soon as it's ready. Yeah. And that might be the thing that suits you. So that's the level where I'm sometimes saying, again, Scrum, and it really is like, okay, Scrum tells me I have a cadence, but then the real point again is, as you said at the beginning, this is an assumption. But is it a good assumption that I need actually a release cadence, or can I release on demand?
Right.
If you think about the latest DevOps evolutions and so forth, yeah. Do I need it really? And if you go back into the XP extreme programming world and again Kanban and things like that, it's like, do I need it? So that's just again to say, constantly review your assumption and where you are, and make sure, okay, is this current framework fitting me as I mean, I hear a lot of people in Agile were saying the first things which is agile in the process is the process itself. If it doesn't fit you, you change it. It's as easy as that.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think as we are learning and as more and more people are adopting Agile, and I think now I'm hoping a lot of people have adopting Agile, at least in the software space. I think more and more patterns are emerging as to what works for what kind of teams. Like if you're a support team, if you're an infra team, if you're a UI or more UX focused team, what really is working and what's not working. And a lot of, I read a lot of Medium blogs and posts, and I'm seeing a lot of material on, hey, this works for our team. It might work for if this is the nature of your deliverables.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up for questions, if anyone here, but if you are live on YouTube, thank you so much for joining. We will be back next week, every Wednesday. But for that, till then, thank you so much. And see you all next week. Okay. Thank you. Okay. For anyone here, please feel free to ask questions. I have stopped and paused the recording on YouTube. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Hey, so very good conversation, very thought-provoking.